Welcome back to the deep dive.
Mhm.
Today, we're going to be tackling something I think a lot of us can relate to, which is that feeling of being overly involved in our families' lives
Mhm.
and vice versa. And you've specifically asked for ways to navigate this dynamic
Yeah.
without held necessarily relying on emotional intelligence or communication or mindfulness.
Which, let's be honest.
Can feel like a pretty tall order when it comes to family, right? Luckily, you provided some interesting material for us to dive into today, including this really intriguing concept of over-sharpening your toothbrush.
Mm.
And who better to help us break this down than expert speaker?
It's great to be back.
So, over-sharpening your toothbrush. As a metaphor for over-involved families, what's the connection?
Yeah. So I think what's so fascinating about this metaphor is it really highlights the unintentional damage, I think, that can occur when we're overly invested in fixing or managing each other's lives. We think we're helping, maybe even showing love, but just like pressing too hard with the toothbrush, it can actually lead to more harm than good. Resentment, burnout, this feeling of being stifled.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see the parallel here for sure. I think we've all been on the giving or receiving end of that kind of help that doesn't always feel so helpful, especially in families. And you also included a story about a couple, Sarah and Mike,
Yeah.
who are struggling with emotional distance.
Mm-hmm.
So how does this whole over-sharpening thing, how does that play out in a more like intimate relationship dynamic?
Yeah, so if we look at Sarah's workaholic tendencies, for
Mhm.
example, and then Mike's emotional withdrawal, it kind of suggests this pattern where they might be trying to fix the other person's unhappiness
Mm.
rather than actually addressing
Nothing.
their own needs.
Right.
So Sarah might be overworking because she wants to create a sense of security that she feels Mike lacks, while Mike's withdrawal could stem from this feeling of, like, he can never live up to her unspoken expectations. It's like they're both brushing too hard in a way, trying to achieve this, like, desired outcome, but ultimately causing more friction and distance.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like their own individual coping mechanism.
Right.
Well, understandable. And kind of feeding into this
Hmm.
bigger problem of feeling over-involved and disconnected. And this brings to mind something else. From the material that you sent, this idea of the illusion of independence.
Hmm.
What exactly does that mean in this context?
So the illusion of independence, I think, comes into play when over-involvement sort of masks itself as self-reliance. So on the surface, it looks like someone is perfectly capable, handling their own business, but underneath, they might be sacrificing their own needs, suppressing their emotions, all to kind of maintain a sense of control. In the family system, they might even feel like they're the strong one, right? The one
Yeah.
holding it all together.
So it's almost like
Yeah.
a defense mechanism in a way
Yeah.
against vulnerability or appearing weak within that family dynamic.
Hmm.
And so they kind of overcompensate.
By becoming overly responsible for others.
Exactly. And this is where I think it gets even trickier
Mhm.
because families often have these unspoken expectations and dynamics that are passed down through generations. It's not always conscious, but these patterns can be
Yeah.
really powerful. That makes a lot of sense. So if we loop back to Sarah and Mike for a second, would you say that both of them are kind of caught up in this illusion of independence then?
Absolutely. But, Sarah's workaholism could be her way of maintaining this illusion of control, while Mike's withdrawal might be his way of protecting himself from feeling inadequate, right?
Yeah.
Or overwhelmed by her efforts to kind of fix things. So both are attempts in their own way to manage the emotional temperature of the relationship, but they end up creating more distance.
Okay, so we've got this over-sharpening metaphor, this illusion of independence.
Yeah.
And then the material that you sent also mentions emotional labor, which I think is a term a lot of people are really grappling with these days. So how does that factor into these over-involved family relationships?
Yeah, this is where the impact of these deeply ingrained patterns, I think, becomes really clear. So emotional labor, right? That often invisible work of managing emotions and caring for others' emotional needs can become a major point of contention in families that are prone to this over-involvement.
So instead of just brushing our own teeth,
Yeah.
so to speak, we're constantly worried about
Yeah.
everyone else's dental hygiene.
Precisely. And like you said, without even realizing it a lot of the time, one or two members might take on the brunt of this emotional labor, right? Anticipating everyone's needs, smoothing over conflicts, trying to keep everyone happy, which we know can be exhausting
Yeah.
and lead to resentment over time.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for burnout, especially for those who feel obligated
Yeah.
to carry that load. In the case of Sarah and Mike,
Mhm.
who would you say is shouldering more of that emotional labor?
I always hesitate to label one person as the emotional laborer. Because I think in any relationship, especially a family dynamic, it's much more nuanced than that.
Right.
So in Sarah and Mike's case, Sarah might be
Right.
really kind of managing those external expectations, trying to present this like picture perfect family life, whereas Mike might be carrying more of the weight of
Yeah.
feeling inadequate or unheard. So they're both forms of emotional labor, just expressed really differently.
That's a really important distinction, I think. Because, it's not just about who's doing more of these chores or planning the events. It's about that kind of underlying emotional responsibility, right? That can really weigh on people, especially in these families that tend towards over-involvement. And you mentioned earlier that we were trying to kind of find ways to navigate this without relying solely on communication or mindfulness, which again can be really tough, especially when these patterns are so deeply ingrained. So what are some alternative approaches in those situations?
Well, one strategy I found really intriguing from the material that you sent is this idea of consciously delegating emotional tasks. And it's really about trying to shift our mindset from that I have to fix this to more of a who can I empower to handle
So
this.
consciously delegating. So instead of just automatically stepping in to solve a problem or manage someone's emotions, we take a step back and we say, okay, who else could be involved here?
Yeah, exactly. So for example, if you have a parent who constantly relies on you for tech support, let's say, instead of always being the go-to person, maybe you delegate that to a sibling or tech-savvy friend, or even like a professional service.
Interesting. So it's not about neglecting the need. It's just about maybe distributing that emotional labor a little bit more evenly.
Exactly.
It's about saying, I trust you to figure this out, rather than I've got this, which I guess ties back into that whole illusion of independence thing too, right? Because by
consciously delegating, we're actually encouraging more independence within our family systems.
Absolutely. And in doing so, we start to break free from those like over-sharpened boundaries.
Right,
We create space for others to develop their own coping mechanisms, their own problem-solving skills. Yeah. It's like we're slowly loosening our grip on that toothbrush a little bit, letting go of the need to control every single aspect of our loved ones' lives. Another concept from the research that you sent that really stood out to me was this idea of emotional debriefing sessions. Can you explain what those are and how they might work, especially in a dynamic where open communication isn't always the easiest thing?
Sure. And it sounds a lot more formal than it needs to be. Really, the core idea is, can we try to establish this neutral, non-judgmental space for family members to just share feelings or experiences without the pressure of like immediately needing to solve a problem or offer advice?
So it's less about finding solutions and more about just validating each other's experiences.
Exactly. And I think the key here is consistency. So just like we might have a standing coffee date with a friend, scheduling regular time for a family check-in can actually create this sense of predictability and safety.
Yeah, which I imagine could be really helpful for families where conflict is often either just completely swept under the rug
or avoided altogether.
Precisely. Because by having that designated time and space to address things, even if it's just for 15 minutes every week, you're creating that container, right, for those emotions to surface in a more controlled environment, rather than them just kind of bubbling over unexpectedly.
It's like creating a pressure valve for those intense family dynamics and allowing some of that built-up steam to be released safely. So if someone's listening to this and they're like, okay, I want to try this whole emotional debriefing thing, but their family runs from anything. Remotely touchy-feely, how would you suggest they even broach the subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's about really framing it in a way that resonates with your family's values and communication style.
You're right.
So maybe instead of calling it an emotional debriefing session, you suggest like a weekly family meeting or a Sunday night check-in. Keep it light, casual, focused on connection rather than criticism. It's all about meeting your family where they are and if they're resistant. To the idea of talking about feelings. Maybe you start by just sharing something positive about your week, or asking about their experiences in a more general sense. It's about planting those seeds of connection and slowly building trust over time.
Exactly. It's about finding their small, manageable ways to shift the dynamic without forcing this like complete overhaul of your family's communication style.
And for those of us who often find ourselves on the receiving end of this over-involvement, constantly being helped or fixed, what are some strategies for setting those much-needed boundaries without necessarily resorting to emotional outbursts or arguments?
Well, one approach that I think aligns with your request for some more non-emotional strategies is what's known as the broken record technique.
Okay.
And that is really about calmly and consistently repeating a predetermined phrase whenever you feel like your boundaries are being crossed.
The broken record technique. So it's about having that go-to phrase that very clearly communicates, this is my need for space, or this is my need for autonomy, without getting completely caught up in the emotional fray.
Exactly.
Can you give us an example?
Absolutely. Let's say your parent constantly criticizes your housekeeping skills, right?
Right.
So instead of engaging in this lengthy defense or an emotional outburst, you might just calmly reply with, I appreciate your concern, but I'm comfortable with the way I manage my home. And the key is to repeat this phrase verbatim without getting defensive or justifying your choices.
So it's about being firm,
Yes.
but respectful,
Yes.
like a gentle but unwavering boundary line.
Yeah.
And over time, that consistent repetition helps to establish the boundary without having to rely on those more emotional arguments or pleas.
Exactly. It takes practice and patience. But like any new habit, it does get easier over time. And remember, setting boundaries is not about being selfish or rejecting your family. It's actually about honoring your own needs and creating a healthier dynamic for everyone involved.
Right. It's like we were saying earlier, it's about recognizing that everyone has their own toothbrush, their own emotional space.
Yeah.
And we don't necessarily have to be responsible for brushing everyone else's teeth for them.
Yeah.
It's like learning to create a little breathing room. You know, even within those really tight-knit family circles.
Yeah.
So that everyone kind of have their own experiences without feeling like they need to constantly manage each other's emotions.
Precisely. It's about finding that delicate balance, right, between connection and autonomy. We can be there for our families, offer support, and maintain those close bonds without falling into those patterns of over-involvement that we've been talking about. That can be so draining for everyone.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. Who knew toothbrush care could be such a powerful metaphor for setting boundaries with our families? It's not about like shutting people out or anything. It's just about creating healthy space for everyone to thrive. So before we wrap up, any final thoughts for our listeners? You ready to maybe swap out that over-sharpened toothbrush for a gentler approach?
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway would be just to remember that change takes time, especially in families where these patterns have been ingrained for years sometimes, even generations, right? So be patient with yourself, with your family members. Start with those small, manageable steps like, those things we talked about, consciously delegating, establishing those regular check-ins, practicing that broken record technique. And don't be afraid to seek out professional support if you need a little extra guidance. Navigating some of these.
More complex family dynamics.
It's about recognizing that. Creating those healthier patterns ultimately benefits everyone in the long run. And it's not about blaming or judging, but just creating that more supportive and fulfilling dynamic for the whole family. Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to chew on, and I hope it's empowered you to create some healthier boundaries in your own life. Until next time, thanks for diving in with us.